The room was small inside California State Prison in Lancaster during the late summer of 2018, with the Texas Ranger sitting across from an old man folded into a government wheelchair. The Ranger, James Holland, slid a recorder closer while the inmate leaned forward, speaking slow, claiming he stopped counting somewhere after 80, maybe closer to 90. Nobody in that room believed the number at first, not from a janitor with shaky hands and prison blues hanging loose on his shoulders. The question was not how many, but how long a man like this could move through cities without anybody putting his name on a chalkboard. Samuel Little entered the world on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, born as Samuel McDowell to a teenage mother named Bessie May, who left him behind almost immediately. Court records later showed his father listed as Paul McDowell, another teenager who never stayed in the picture long enough to matter. By the time Samuel could walk straight, his grandmother had taken him north to Lorain, Ohio, a steel town sitting hard along Lake Erie, where nobody was watching him close. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School for a short while, drifting through classes without focus, leaving school early without finishing, stepping into the streets long before adulthood arrived. From the start, his thoughts leaned toward dark places that most children never admit out loud, especially when he later described staring at women's necks in kindergarten with feelings he could not explain. He collected crime magazines during his teenage years, flipping pages filled with drawings of strangled women, saving pictures that showed hands tightening around throats. He later told investigators that the sight of a woman touching her own neck made his chest tighten, as if some switch inside his mind had already been wired wrong. Nobody around him noticed the pattern forming, since poor grades, quiet behavior, and small thefts did not raise alarms in a factory town full of broken families. By 13 years old, he was arrested for stealing a bicycle, which sent him into an Ohio juvenile reform school that taught him discipline through fists instead of guidance. At 15, police in Omaha, Nebraska caught him for burglary, and by 16 he was breaking into furniture stores back in Lorain without much fear. In 1961, at age 21, a conviction for burglary sent him to prison for 3 years, releasing him in 1964 with no trade and no future planned. Between 1964 and 1975, he was arrested 26 times across 11 states, charged with theft, assault, fraud, and rape, drifting without roots or supervision. During those years, he grew into a heavy frame, standing 6'3" and weighing over 200 pounds, built wide from prison boxing rings and street fights. Inside prisons, he boxed for reputation, earning the nickname Mad Daddy from guards who watched him flatten men with short hooks and steady footwork. Those fists would later become tools, not only for fighting, but for knocking women unconscious before his hands moved to their throats. He worked odd jobs as a cemetery groundskeeper, an ambulance attendant, and a janitor, slipping into positions that required silence more than background checks. He moved constantly, stealing merchandise with girlfriends, fencing goods for cash, checking into cheap motels under borrowed names, rarely staying long enough to leave a trail. One girlfriend later told police that he spent days shoplifting and nights meeting women, sometimes disappearing until sunrise without explanation. Another partner described him coming home with scratches, claiming bar fights or disputes that never quite made sense. By the late 1960s, the shape of his future had already formed, built from violence, drifting, and a fixation nobody could see yet. What mattered most was not where he lived, but what he carried inside, a compulsion tied to strength, silence, and the belief that some people could vanish without consequence. Every arrest that ended lightly taught him the same lesson, which was that bruises healed faster than records, and victims rarely carried weight in courtrooms. By the time he left his 20s behind, he had learned how to move, how to charm, how to deny, and how to walk away when police grew tired. The tools were ready long before the first body ever touched the ground. Around late 1969 or early 1970, Samuel Little arrived in Miami, Florida, drifting south with no address, no job, and no reason to stay anywhere long. He later told investigators that his first victim sat inside a Coconut Grove restaurant, wearing a red leather dress, crossing her legs, touching her neck without knowing who watched. He offered her a ride that night, driving toward quiet streets, stopping where nobody waited, tightening his hands until her body stopped moving. He did not remember her name, only her hair color and the way she stopped struggling, which mattered more to him than identity. That body was never officially tied to him, and Miami police never opened a murder case, since nothing about the scene looked urgent enough to demand answers. From that moment forward, he understood something important, which was that strangulation left little noise and even less proof when the right victim disappeared. Within months, he was killing women who sold sex, women who used drugs, women who slept in shelters, women whose families had already lost track of them. He learned that when a poor woman died without visible wounds, doctors often wrote overdose, accident, or natural causes, then closed the folder. In 1971, a hunter found the decomposed remains of Mary Brosley outside Miami, partially buried. Blood alcohol near lethal levels, cause of death undetermined. Police listed her death as suspicious, not homicide, and the case went cold until a coroner changed the ruling more than 10 years later. In 1975, in Knoxville, Tennessee, Martha Cunningham vanished walking to church. Later found bruised, half-dressed, declared a natural death by officials. In 1977 in Illinois, Mary Ann Jenkins was found naked with jewelry still on, speculated to have died from lightning without a homicide investigation open. In 1984 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Jolanda Jones was discovered in an abandoned house with a crack pipe nearby, ruled an overdose until his confession decades later. Each time, the same mistake repeated, which was assuming that certain women died the way the world expected them to die. Little understood that pattern early, choosing victims whose lives already carried labels that softened the question of how they ended. He never used knives or guns, relying only on hands, pressure, and patience, which left few marks for pathologists to measure. He traveled through Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, Illinois, and Arkansas during those years, leaving bodies that never shared a file number. He never bragged then, never wrote letters, never returned to scenes long enough to be remembered. His strength allowed him to overpower without struggle, while his silence allowed him to walk away without witnesses. The years between 1970 and 1976 passed without a single murder charge attached to his name, even as his count quietly climbed. What protected him most was not intelligence, but neglect, since every misclassified death built another layer of invisibility around his movements. He learned where to hunt, how to leave, how to choose women. Nobody would search for more than a week. By the time he reached his mid-30s, he had already done what most killers never manage, which was to turn absence into camouflage. Long before anyone called him a serial murderer, he had already become a ghost moving through police reports without a face. On the morning of September 11, 1976, a young black woman ran barefoot through a quiet subdivision in Sunset Hills, Missouri, knocking on doors until one finally opened. The woman was naked, bruised across her face and neck, shaking while telling the homeowner that a man had wrapped a cord around her throat and dragged her into a car. Police arrived within minutes, hearing how the attacker had strangled her unconscious, raped her, then fallen asleep while she escaped into the street. She described a black Chevrolet Impala parked on a gravel road nearby, with clothes scattered across the back seat. Officers drove the short distance she described and found the Impala exactly where she said it would be, engine still warm, parked crooked beside the road. In the back seat, they saw women's clothing, torn and tangled, and on the floor a black electrical cord matching the one she said tightened around her neck. Inside the car, stretched across the back seat and snoring, lay a 36-year-old man named Samuel Little. When police woke him and placed him in cuffs, the victim identified him immediately, without hesitation, pointing at him as the man who almost killed her. Detectives booked Little on charges of rape, sodomy, and felonious assault, believing they had caught a predator in the act with physical evidence and a living witness. Inside the interview room, Little admitted beating the woman, but denied rape, claiming she was a prostitute who cheated him in a drug deal. He said the fight was over money, not sex, repeating that story until officers wrote it into their notes. That version mattered more than he understood, since it gave prosecutors a narrow path away from a full jury trial. The victim had a documented heroin addiction, a detail that soon shifted how the case moved through the courthouse. Prosecutors worried that a jury in 1976 Missouri would not believe a young black woman with a drug habit over a tall, calm man who admitted only to assault. Rather than risk losing everything at trial, they offered Little a plea deal that reduced rape to assault with intent to ravish. Little accepted without hesitation, signing away a charge that might have sent him to prison for decades. The judge sentenced him to 3 months in county jail and a $100 fine, counting time he had already served while awaiting trial. By December of 1976, Samuel Little walked out of custody, free before Christmas, carrying no felony rape conviction on his record. The woman he strangled watched him leave through a courtroom door, knowing the system had already decided whose story mattered more. Retired public defender Richard Rodemeyer later admitted that the deal reflected fear, not evidence, since prosecutors doubted the victim would survive cross-examination. In a city where sex workers rarely won credibility, justice bent toward convenience instead of protection. Little learned something precise from that courtroom, which was that violence without a corpse rarely stayed punished for long. He left Missouri understanding that survival as a victim counted less than composure as a defendant. When he returned to the streets, he did not slow down, since every part of the process had confirmed his instincts about how the world worked. He had been identified, arrested, and caught with the weapon in his car, yet still walked free within weeks. That outcome taught him that denial worked, that calm worked, and that women with criminal histories carried no shield in front of judges. Police in Missouri closed the file, believing they had handled a single assault, unaware that the man they released had already killed before arriving in their state. No statewide bulletin went out, no federal alert circulated, and no one tracked his name across jurisdictions. He simply drifted away again, carrying the same habits, the same hands, and a growing confidence that strangulation left no lasting trail. The cost of that decision never appeared in court transcripts, but it appeared later in police reports from cities hundreds of miles apart. Every victim who followed was connected to that morning in September when a woman escaped, spoke clearly, and still lost. The failure was not dramatic, not loud, not violent, but administrative, procedural, and invisible, which made it far more dangerous. By the time Little crossed into another state, he understood that identification meant nothing without consequences, and that silence often protected him better than speed. That knowledge became part of his method, guiding how he chose victims, where he attacked, and when he disappeared. Long before anyone called him a serial killer, he had already learned how to defeat a courtroom without ever raising his voice. Not long after his release from Missouri, Samuel Little reconnected with a woman named Aurelia Jean Dorsey, nearly 30 years older than him, whom he had first met in an Ohio jail. In 1971, she warned him that a girlfriend planned to testify against him in a robbery case, a warning that helped him beat those charges. From that moment, she became more than a partner, becoming protection, accomplice, and anchor in a drifting life. When both left custody, they stayed together, moving across the country without an address or schedule. Jan Dorsey and Little traveled in stolen cars, cheap sedans, and battered wagons, checking into motels under false names, leaving towns before clerks remembered faces. Their income came from shoplifting, stealing clothing, cigarettes, electronics, and groceries, then fencing the goods for cash. In some stores, Jean walked slowly with a limp, drawing sympathy, while Little carried bags out pretending to help an elderly woman. They moved from Mississippi to Florida, from Ohio to Arkansas, rarely staying more than weeks in one place. One young accomplice named Danny Beckless later told police that they lived entirely from theft, selling merchandise to small-time fences along highways. He said Little left at night to meet women, returning before dawn, while Jean asked no questions that forced answers. Beckless remembered Little saying he liked taking women places, then leaving them behind, words that sounded harmless at the time. Only later did those phrases take on meaning. Investigators later suspected that Jean may have seen signs of what he did, even if she never spoke them aloud. A Cleveland detective reported that Jean once burned bloody clothing in a fireplace after finding stains inside their car. When questioned years later, Little laughed and said she never asked him anything she did not want to hear. Whether she knew the truth or chose not to know became one of the unanswered parts of his story. What mattered most was how their partnership created mobility, money, and cover, allowing him to hunt in one state, then vanish into another before police could connect cases. Jean handled the thefts, arranged the rooms, managed the travel, while Little moved freely at night. Their routine became a moving crime engine, crossing state lines without records, living off cash and silence. Between 1971 and 1986, they passed through dozens of cities, leaving behind a trail of theft reports, assault arrests, and unconnected deaths. Jean gave him stability without permanence, allowing him to remain transient while never alone. Every time he left a body behind, the car already pointed toward another state line. When Jan suffered a brain hemorrhage in the late 1980s and died, the only person who had watched his movements for 15 years disappeared without testimony. By then, he had already learned how to operate without partners, carrying the same habits into the next decade. The woman who traveled with the killer left behind no confession, no record, and no answers, only a long road that carried him from city to city without interruption. In September of 1982, Samuel Little arrived in Pascagoula, Mississippi, driving an old car with no plan beyond finding work and finding women nobody protected. He spent nights drinking in small bars along Highway 90, watching who came alone, watching who left alone, learning the rhythm of a port town that forgot faces quickly. One evening, he met a 22-year-old woman named Melinda Lepre, who had been struggling with addiction and drifting between couches and shelters. Witnesses later said they left a bar together, walking toward his car without urgency, disappearing into the humid darkness without anyone following. 3 days later, on September 7, 1982, fishermen found Melinda Lepre's naked body floating near the Pascagoula River, tangled in weeds close to the shoreline. The coroner listed bruising on her neck, abrasions on her arms, and signs of manual strangulation, but also noted alcohol and drugs in her system. Police opened a homicide investigation, but quietly treated the case as another dead sex worker found near the water. In a town used to bodies washing up from barges and fights, urgency faded fast. What made this case different was that Melinda Lepre was not the only woman who had escaped him in Pascagoula. Earlier that same year, a woman named Carol Alford had survived an assault after a man strangled her unconscious inside a car, leaving her for dead. She later described her attacker as a tall black man with a heavy build, calm voice, and short hair, a description that matched Little exactly. Another woman, Jacqueline Thomas, also survived a similar attack and gave police the same description, pointing to the same man without knowing his name. When police arrested Samuel Little on unrelated theft charges weeks later, both women were brought into view a lineup. Carol Alford identified him immediately, without hesitation, stating clearly that he was the man who had tried to kill her. Jacqueline Thomas also identified him as her attacker, repeating details about his car and his hands that matched police notes. Detectives believed they finally had a suspect tied to multiple assaults and a fresh murder. They charged Little with the murder of Melinda Lepre and attempted murder in the two surviving cases, preparing the file for presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. On paper, the case looked strong, since two living victims identified him and the murder victim matched the same method. In practice, the case collapsed the moment it entered the courtroom system. Both surviving women had histories of prostitution and drug use, a detail that defense attorneys emphasized from the first hearing. Prosecutors worried that a mostly white Mississippi jury would not trust black women labeled as sex workers, no matter how consistent their testimony sounded. They also worried that Little, calm, and soft-spoken would appear more credible than women with arrest records. When the grand jury convened in December of 1982, prosecutors presented the evidence without passion, without framing, and without explaining the pattern forming across cases. They did not call expert witnesses, did not explain strangulation injuries, and did not push the timeline hard. After brief deliberation, the grand jury declined to indict Samuel Little for murder or attempted murder. The decision stunned detectives, since they believed they had finally cornered a man who would not stop on his own. With no indictment, Little was released from custody within days, walking out of the Jackson County Jail with no charges pending. The two women who identified him were never called back, never protected, and never told what the decision would cost. Later reviews showed that prosecutors never appealed, never sought a new panel, and never forwarded his name to federal authorities. No bulletin warned other states, no file flagged him as a serial offender, and no pattern analysis followed his movements. Pascagoula closed the case as unsolved, filing it among dozens of others involving women with no political value. For Little, the message was clearer than any courtroom lecture could have been, since two witnesses pointing at him still failed to keep him in custody. He understood that being identified meant nothing if the victim carried the wrong reputation. He understood that juries did not fear the deaths of women already written off by society. Within weeks, he left Mississippi and returned to Florida, carrying a confidence far stronger than before. He later told investigators that Pascagoula was the moment he realized nobody was truly looking for him. From that point forward, he increased his pace, moving faster between cities, killing more often, staying less time in each place. Between 1983 and 1996, he killed in Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Houston, Little Rock, New Orleans, Miami, and dozens of towns in between. Many of those murders followed the same pattern used on Melinda Lepre, which was hands to throat, pressure until silence, and bodies left where water or strangers would find them. Investigators who reviewed the Pascagoula file decades later agreed on one point without debate, which was that the grand jury decision marked the turning point of his career. Before Mississippi, he killed cautiously and waited months between attacks. After Mississippi, he killed more freely, believing no system would ever follow him across borders. One retired detective later said that if Pascagoula had indicted him, more than half of his victims would still be alive. That estimate came from mapping his confession dates against the calendar after 1982. The math was brutal, simple, and impossible to ignore. The women who testified never learned how many lives followed their failure in court, since nobody ever told them that their case became the hinge of a national tragedy. Melinda Lepre remained a name in a local ledger, one more unsolved death near the river. The grand jury that said no never reconvened, never apologized, and never learned what they released into the country. For Samuel Little, Pascagoula became proof that the system would not stop him, no matter how clearly he stood in front of it. That single decision did not create a killer, but it gave one permission to continue. By the spring of 1984, Samuel Little had settled briefly in Pinellas County, Florida, working odd jobs and drifting through bars along Clearwater and St. Petersburg, moving with the same quiet routine he had used in Mississippi. On May 18, 1984, he met a 46-year-old woman named Patricia Mount, a part-time sex worker struggling with addiction and unstable housing. Witnesses later said they saw the two leave a bar together in his car, heading toward a residential area without drawing attention. That night, inside a quiet house in St. Petersburg, he strangled her with his hands until her breathing stopped, then wiped down the room and walked out before dawn. The next morning, Patricia Mount's body was discovered by her roommate, lying on a bed with bruises across her neck and face, jewelry still on her fingers, no sign of robbery or forced entry. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by manual strangulation, one of the few times in Little's career that a coroner clearly recognized the method. Police canvassed the neighborhood and quickly learned that she had left the bar with a tall black man driving an older sedan. Within days, multiple witnesses described the same man, and one bartender gave police his name after checking a tab. When officers arrested Samuel Little later that week on an unrelated theft charge, they placed him in a lineup for the Mount investigation. Two witnesses identified him as the man last seen with Patricia Mount, and forensic technicians recovered hair from the bed that appeared microscopically consistent with his. Prosecutors believed they finally had a clean murder case, with physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and a victim whose death had not been misclassified. The trial opened in 1985 in Pinellas County Circuit Court, with Assistant State Attorney Robert Schaefer presenting the case as a straightforward homicide. He told jurors that Little was the last man seen with Mount, that the hair matched his, and that no other suspect fit the timeline. The defense, led by attorney Mark Greenberg, focused entirely on attacking the witnesses and questioning the reliability of hair comparison, which in that era was treated as science without statistical certainty. Greenberg argued that the hair evidence proved nothing, since microscopic comparison could not identify a single person, only exclude some. He also reminded jurors that Patricia Mount was a sex worker with multiple clients, suggesting that any of them could have been responsible. Witnesses were cross-examined aggressively about drinking, memory gaps, and prior arrests, turning the focus away from the defendant and onto the victim's life. After several days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. Samuel Little stood calmly as the clerk read the decision, showing no reaction, then shook his lawyer's hand and walked out of the courthouse free. For the second time in less than 3 years, a jury had listened to evidence tying him to strangulation and still refused to convict. Within weeks, he was arrested again on unrelated charges and sent to the Florida State Prison System for theft and fraud, serving short sentences that kept him off the streets for brief periods. Inside prison, he talked freely, not to guards, but to other inmates, sharing fragments of stories that sounded exaggerated and unreal. One inmate later reported that Little bragged about killing dozens of women across the country, claiming police would never catch him. In 1984, a Florida corrections officer named James Purdy wrote a letter to the FBI after hearing those stories, describing an inmate who hinted he had killed more than 60 women in multiple states. Purdy included Little's name, physical description, and prison location, warning that he might be dealing with a serial murderer. The letter was routed to the FBI field office in Jacksonville, then forwarded to headquarters in Washington. At the bureau, the letter was logged, summarized, and filed without investigation. No agent interviewed Little, no analyst compared the claim to unsolved cases, and no alert went out to state police agencies. The FBI later admitted that the information was treated as jailhouse boasting, not actionable intelligence. In an era before national databases and pattern analysis, the warning died quietly inside a filing cabinet. Little was released from Florida custody in 1989 after serving time for theft and assault, carrying no murder conviction and no federal flag attached to his name. He left the state and headed west, moving toward California, where his most active years were about to begin. The acquittal in Florida and the ignored letter formed a dangerous combination, which was public exoneration, followed by institutional silence. What made this moment critical was not only the verdict, but the failure to connect information across systems. Mississippi had declined to indict him 2 years earlier. Florida had just acquitted him of murder. A prison officer had warned federal authorities that he claimed dozens of victims. None of those pieces were assembled into a single picture. From that point forward, every police department treated him as a local offender with a short record, never as a traveling predator. When he arrived in Los Angeles in the late 1980s, detectives had no reason to suspect that a man with theft arrests and assault charges carried a national body count. The absence of coordination created a blind spot large enough for him to disappear inside. Years later, FBI analysts reviewing the Purdy letter called it one of the greatest missed opportunities in modern criminal history. Had agents interviewed Little in prison in 1984, his confession might have come 25 years earlier, while many victims were still alive. Instead, the Bureau never followed through, never sent his name to VICAP, and never built a case around his claims. For Little, the Florida acquittal closed the last door that might have stopped him early. He had survived identification in Missouri, rejection in Mississippi, and now acquittal in Florida, each time learning that courts did not fear him. By the time he left the state, he believed the system itself had proven his invisibility. The pattern that would define the rest of his life was now complete, which was killing in one state, vanishing into another, and trusting that no central authority would ever track the movement. Florida did not just lose a case, it helped create a national failure, one built from isolation, skepticism, and silence. When investigators finally interviewed him in 2018, Little mentioned the Florida trial casually, describing it as the moment he realized nobody was sharing information about him. He said that after St. Petersburg, he stopped worrying about being caught, since even when he was caught, nothing happened. That confidence would follow him into California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and beyond, carrying a warning that had once reached the FBI and then disappeared without a trace. By the late 1980s, Samuel Little arrived in Los Angeles carrying nothing that marked him as dangerous beyond a quiet manner and a long history of drifting. He rented rooms in South Central, worked janitorial jobs under borrowed names, and spent nights moving through bars along Figueroa Street and Alameda, watching who stood alone. The city at that time was already saturated with violence, since crack cocaine had flooded neighborhoods and homicide rates were climbing past 1,000 a year. Serial killers operated inside that chaos without drawing attention, since gunfire and gang wars filled the news every night. South Los Angeles in 1987 was a place where police chased drive-by shooters, not men who strangled women quietly inside apartments. Patrol units focused on Crips, Bloods, and open-air drug markets, leaving domestic calls and transient deaths at the bottom of the priority list. In those same years, killers like the Grim Sleeper were active, dumping bodies in alleys that officers already expected to find. Little understood quickly that this city offered cover unlike any he had known before. He moved through neighborhoods near Florence Avenue, Vermont Avenue, and Central Avenue, working days mopping floors and scrubbing stairwells, then hunting after dark. He targeted women who used drugs, women who traded sex for shelter, women who slept in abandoned buildings, and women whose families had already lost track of them. The method never changed, since he struck inside cars, motel rooms, and small apartments where noise did not travel far. One of the earliest confirmed California victims was a woman named Carol Alford, killed in 1987 after meeting him near downtown Los Angeles. Her body was found with bruises on her neck, no defensive wounds, and no obvious trauma that demanded further testing. The coroner listed the cause as undetermined, and the case closed without a homicide designation. That same year, he killed a woman named Guadalupe Apodaca in Los Angeles, leaving her body in an alley where officers assumed overdose and moved on. In 1989, he strangled Audrey Nelson in South Los Angeles after picking her up near a liquor store, driving her to a quiet street, and killing her inside his car. Nelson's body was discovered with alcohol in her system and no visible injuries beyond faint neck marks that faded within hours. The death was recorded as accidental, another file placed in storage without investigation. Each time the same pattern protected him, since manual strangulation left few marks and required careful interpretation that busy medical examiners rarely provided. What made California different was not only the volume of killing, but the way multiple predators operated at the same time. Between 1985 and 2005, Los Angeles hosted at least 10 active serial killers, including Lonnie Franklin, Chester Turner, and later Michael Gargiulo. Bodies appeared weekly in alleys, dumpsters, and vacant lots, creating an environment where patterns dissolved into noise. Little became one more shadow inside a city already drowning in unsolved deaths. His method relied on patience more than force, since he knocked women unconscious with short blows before applying pressure to the carotid arteries, cutting blood flow to the brain. He told investigators later that he counted seconds, not minutes, releasing his grip only when the body went limp and breathing stopped. Because he avoided crushing the trachea, he rarely fractured cartilage, which meant autopsies often missed the signs of homicide. Medical examiners in Los Angeles at that time handled hundreds of cases a month, with limited budgets and no mandate to test every unexplained death. Toxicology screens detected drugs and alcohol, which offered easy explanations when no broken bones appeared. Strangulation without hyoid fractures looked like natural collapse, especially when the victim carried addiction in her history. That weakness in the system became his greatest ally. During those years, he lived in cheap apartments, shelters, and halfway houses, often registered under false names, sometimes using stolen identification. He told police later that he preferred Los Angeles because nobody asked questions when tenants came and went. He moved every few months, leaving behind jobs and rooms before landlords remembered his face. Inside his own language, he gave himself a nickname, calling himself the choke and stroke killer, a phrase he later explained without emotion. He said he associated sexual release with strangulation, claiming that the moment of death brought a sensation he could not replace any other way. Investigators documented those statements carefully, avoiding sensational terms, while noting that the sexual component explained the consistency of his method. Between 1987 and 2000, he killed at least 20 women in California alone, though only a handful were identified at the time. In 1990, he strangled a woman named Betty Ware in South Central, whose death was ruled accidental due to intoxication. In 1991, he killed a woman named Christine Moore, left in a vacant lot, never linked to homicide. In 1992, he murdered a woman known only as Jane Doe, 1982, whose identity remained unknown for decades. He moved freely between Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Bernardino, sometimes killing in one county and working in another within days. Police departments did not share information on undetermined deaths, and no central database compared patterns of strangulation across jurisdictions. Every misclassified case added another layer of safety around his movements. What protected him most during this period was not secrecy, but the city itself, since Los Angeles had more bodies than investigators and more suspects than analysts. When a woman died in an alley, officers wrote overdose and cleared the scene. When a woman died in a motel, managers called it a domestic dispute and moved on. When a woman died in a car, paramedics blamed alcohol and closed the door. By the mid-1990s, he was killing more often, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a single year, without altering his routine. He rarely kept souvenirs, rarely returned to scenes, and never contacted police or newspapers. His discipline separated him from killers who sought attention, allowing him to remain invisible. Later, detectives reviewing his California timeline concluded that at least half of his Los Angeles victims had been ruled accidental or natural at the time of death. Those decisions prevented homicide detectives from ever opening files, which meant no suspect lists, no witness canvases, and no follow-up. The system never looked for him, since officially, his victims were not murdered. By the time he left California in the early 2000s, he carried a body count higher than any other period of his life. He moved east again toward Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and the South, leaving behind a city that had never known he was there. Years later, when Texas Ranger James Holland confronted him with photographs from Los Angeles cases, Little identified victims by name, by street, and by position of the body. He described apartments, cars, and alleys with accuracy that matched police reports written 30 years earlier. Investigators realized that the heaviest portion of his career had unfolded in plain sight inside one of the most policed cities in America. California did not create Samuel Little, but it allowed him to operate at full scale, protected by volume, bias, and exhaustion. By the time the city moved on to the next crisis, he had already moved on to the next state, carrying methods that had worked too well to abandon. Between 1988 and 1990, Samuel Little's life fell into a repeating cycle that became as predictable as it was dangerous, moving between brief jail sentences and immediate returns to killing. In 1988, Los Angeles police arrested him for theft and assault, sending him to county jail for several months, where he kept a low profile and avoided disciplinary reports. When he was released in early 1989, he left custody with no supervision, no parole monitoring that crossed state lines, and no restrictions that limited his movement. Within weeks, he was back on the streets, moving through the same bars and shelters where he had hunted before. In April of 1989, shortly after one such release, he killed a woman in downtown Los Angeles whose name would not be identified until decades later. Her body was found behind a commercial building with alcohol in her system and faint neck bruising, recorded as accidental collapse. That killing marked the pattern that would repeat for years, which was incarceration, release, and immediate resumption of violence. He later told investigators that jail only interrupted his routine, never changed it. In 1990, he was sentenced again, this time to 18 months in California State Prison for assault and fraud, serving most of the term without incident. Inside prison, he avoided fights, boxed occasionally, and spent long hours watching other inmates, studying how people moved when they thought nobody paid attention. Guards described him as quiet, cooperative, and unremarkable, the type of inmate who blended into the background. When he was released in late 1991, no authority flagged his name, and no homicide detective contacted parole. Within months of that release, he left California and headed east, beginning a new phase of his career that expanded across the Southwest and the South. In 1992, he arrived in Las Vegas, Nevada, working briefly as a janitor at a motel near Fremont Street. That summer, he strangled a woman later identified as Denise Brothers, leaving her body in a vacant lot where police assumed overdose and closed the case. Days later, he crossed into Arizona, killing a woman in Phoenix whose death was ruled natural due to intoxication. By 1993, he was in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he murdered a woman named Vicky Cox after meeting her near a bus station. Her body was found behind a warehouse, ruled accidental due to drug use, and buried without further investigation. He remained in Arkansas for several months, stealing cars and shoplifting to fund his travel, then moved south into Mississippi. In Jackson, he killed another woman whose name was never recorded in police files, leaving her in an abandoned house where squatters later found her. Every time he was arrested for theft, assault, or fraud, he served short sentences that removed him from the streets for months, then returned him to freedom without oversight. He later described that rhythm as a reset, saying that prison cooled him down, but never cured him. Each release felt like permission to begin again, since the system never connected his movements to deaths. Between 1992 and 1996, he killed in Nevada, Arizona, Arkansas, Texas, and Mississippi, sometimes crossing 2 states in a single week. In Houston, in 1994, he strangled a woman named Evelyn Weston after picking her up near a bus stop, leaving her in a field where police ruled heat exhaustion. In Dallas in 1995, he killed a woman whose body was never identified, closing another file without homicide charges. What made this period especially lethal was how little time passed between his releases and his next attacks. In one instance, he was released from an Arizona jail in March of 1993 and killed again within 10 days. In another, he left a Nevada jail in 1994 and killed within a month. He told investigators later that he never needed time to plan, since the urge returned as soon as he was free. Police departments in these states never exchanged information about his arrests, since none of his charges involved homicide. Parole officers monitored only local behavior, not travel patterns, and no federal agency tracked his movement. Each county saw him as a petty criminal, not a traveling predator. By the late 1990s, he was older, heavier, and less mobile, but still capable of overpowering victims with experience and patience. His killings became less frequent, but more deliberate, focusing on isolated areas where discovery would take time. The rhythm remained the same, which was freedom, brief custody, then renewed violence, repeating until his body began to fail. In September of 2005, Samuel Little arrived in Tupelo, Mississippi, living out of his car and sleeping in shelters after drifting through Texas and Arkansas. He was 65 years old, heavier than before, with diabetes, high blood pressure, and chronic pain in his knees and back. Despite his age, he still moved through bars and shelters, watching who sat alone, waiting for opportunities that no longer came easily. On September 19, 2005, he met a 41-year-old woman named Nancy Stevens near a convenience store, offering her a ride to another part of the town. They drove to a quiet area outside Tupelo, where he strangled her inside his car using the same method he had used for decades. He left her body in a wooded area near a dirt road, covering her with leaves, then drove away before dawn. 2 days later, a passerby found Nancy Stevens' body, partially decomposed, with no obvious signs of trauma beyond faint neck discoloration. The coroner ruled the death suspicious, but not definitively homicide, listing exposure and intoxication as contributing factors. Police opened a limited investigation, then closed the case when no witnesses came forward. It became the last known murder he committed. After Tupelo, his health began to decline rapidly, limiting his ability to travel and overpower victims. Diabetes caused nerve damage in his feet, making it painful to walk long distances. Arthritis reduced the strength in his hands, and vision problems made night driving dangerous. He later told investigators that his body simply stopped cooperating with his urges. He moved between shelters in Kentucky, Ohio, and California, living on disability checks and small thefts, rarely traveling far from urban centers. By 2008, he was using a wheelchair part-time, unable to stand for long periods without pain. The physical decline created a barrier that law enforcement never managed to create. The silence after 2005 was not the result of fear or repentance, but of incapacity. He did not stop wanting to kill, but he lost the strength to do it safely. Without the ability to knock women unconscious or control their bodies, he avoided situations that risked resistance. For the next 7 years, he lived quietly, drifting between homeless shelters, hospitals, and short jail stays for petty crimes. In 2012, he was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, after trying to cash a stolen check at a bank. A routine DNA sample taken during booking would finally connect him to 3 murders in Los Angeles, ending his freedom without anyone realizing how long it had lasted. The years between 2005 and 2012 passed without killings, without investigations, and without attention, forming the longest quiet period of his adult life. He later described those years as empty, filled with pain, illness, and boredom, not remorse. By the time police finally confronted him with evidence in 2012, he had already lived more than 40 years beyond his first murder. The long silence after Tupelo did not mark redemption, only exhaustion, setting the stage for a confession that would arrive too late for almost everyone who could have been saved. In the spring of 2012, Samuel Little was living in Louisville, Kentucky, sleeping in shelters, using a wheelchair part-time, and surviving on disability checks and small thefts. On September 5, 2012, he walked into a bank on South Brook Street and attempted to cash a stolen check using a forged identification card. The teller noticed inconsistencies, alerted security, and police arrested him within minutes without resistance. At that moment, no officer in the building believed they had just taken custody of the most prolific serial killer in American history. Because Kentucky law required DNA collection from all felony arrestees, technicians swabbed his cheek during booking and entered the sample into the combined DNA index system known as CODIS. The sample sat in the database for months, unremarkable among thousands of others, until analysts in California ran a routine search in early 2013. That search produced 3 cold case hits from Los Angeles County, each involving women strangled between 1987 and 1989. The first match came from the murder of Carol Alford, killed in 1987 in downtown Los Angeles, whose DNA had been preserved from fingernail scrapings. The second match connected him to Audrey Nelson, killed in 1989 in South Los Angeles, whose rape kit had been stored for decades. The third match tied him to Guadalupe Apodaca, killed in 1989 and left in an alley, whose biological evidence had never previously been tested. Los Angeles detectives flew to Louisville in January of 2013 to interview the man now formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. They found an old, overweight inmate who denied everything at first, claiming he had never been in California during those years. When they showed him photographs of the victims, he stared quietly, then looked away, offering no details. Investigators left without a confession, believing they would have to win the case in court on DNA alone. He was extradited to California in September of 2013 and housed in Los Angeles County Jail, where prosecutors prepared for trial on the 3 murders. The media began reporting his arrest as the capture of a possible serial killer, but the scope of his crimes remained unknown. At that time, police believed they had solved 3 long unsolved homicides, nothing more. The trial began in the spring of 2014 in Los Angeles Superior Court, with Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman presenting DNA evidence as the foundation of the case. She explained to jurors how genetic material linked him conclusively to the 3 victims, removing any doubt about identity. Defense attorneys attacked the age of the samples, chain of custody, and laboratory procedures, but experts testified that the probability of error was virtually non-existent. Witnesses described how each woman had last been seen with a tall black man driving an older car, a description that matched him closely. Forensic pathologists explained how strangulation could leave minimal injuries, clarifying why the cases had been misclassified originally. After several weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of murder. In September of 2014, the judge sentenced Samuel Little to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never leave prison alive. At the sentencing hearing, prosecutors spoke about closure for 3 families who had waited more than 25 years for answers. Nobody in the courtroom mentioned any other victims, since nobody yet knew they existed. At that point, law enforcement believed the case was finished, a rare success where DNA had solved 3 cold murders from the late 1980s. He was transferred to California State Prison in Corcoran, classified as a multiple murderer, and placed into the general population without special monitoring. Prison records listed him as a violent offender with 3 victims, nothing more. What made this moment deceptive was how little the system still understood about who he really was. No one reviewed his old arrests in Mississippi or Florida. No one re-examined the grand jury failure in Pascagoula or the acquittal in Pinellas County. No one connected the ignored FBI letter from 1984 to the man now sitting in a California cell. For nearly 4 years after his conviction, he remained an anonymous lifer, one more aging murderer serving time in a crowded prison system. Investigators closed their files, Families buried their grief, and the state of California considered the matter resolved. The world still believed he was responsible for only 3 murders, a small number by serial killer standards, and a story already fading from headlines. It would take a single interview in 2018 to reveal that those 3 convictions had only opened the door to something far larger, something that had been moving quietly across the country for more than 4 decades. By the summer of 2018, Samuel Little had spent nearly 4 years in California State Prison at Corcoran, aging quietly inside a wheelchair, known only as a man who had killed 3 women in Los Angeles. His health had deteriorated further, with diabetes, heart disease, and limited mobility, making daily life slow and painful. Prison staff described him as talkative with inmates, but guarded with investigators, a man who liked attention but avoided formal questioning. It was inside that setting that a Texas Ranger named James Holland decided to try a different approach. Holland had been working cold cases in Texas for decades, specializing in homicides involving women whose deaths had been misclassified. In 2018, he reviewed the Nancy Stevens case from Tupelo and noticed similarities to other strangulation deaths across the South and West. When he learned that a man convicted in California had lived in many of those same cities, he requested permission to interview Little, not as a suspect, but as a potential source of information. When Holland arrived at Corcoran in September of 2018, he did not bring handcuffs, photographs, or warrants, only a recorder and a box of fast food. He began the conversation without accusations, asking Little about his childhood, his travels, and his years on the road. He offered simple comforts, cheeseburgers, milkshakes, and conversation, building trust before ever mentioning murder. The strategy depended on one crucial assurance, which was that Holland made clear he was not seeking the death penalty. Little had spent his life avoiding capital punishment, and the promise that he would never face execution removed his final fear. Holland told him directly that he was already serving life, and nothing he said would make his sentence worse. That assurance shifted the balance of power inside the room. During the first interview, Little spoke cautiously, offering fragments of stories without names or locations. He hinted at killings in Florida, Mississippi, and California, then stopped himself, watching Holland's reaction. Holland did not interrupt, did not correct him, and did not challenge inconsistencies, allowing the narrative to unfold at its own pace. By the second interview, Little began giving specific details, describing a woman in Florida, then another in Ohio, then one in California. Within weeks, the dam began to crack. He confessed first to 4 murders, then 8, then 15, each time adding names, dates, and locations. He described apartments, motel rooms, and cars with precision, sketching floor plans and street corners from memory. He asked for paper and pencils, drawing portraits of women he had killed, capturing hairstyles, cheekbones, and expressions that matched missing persons photographs from decades earlier. Investigators from the FBI, the Texas Rangers, and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department formed a task force to verify his claims. They compared his statements to unsolved cases in dozens of states, matching dates, methods, and locations. In Houston, detectives reopened files from the 1990s and found that his descriptions matched crime scenes precisely. In Las Vegas, police identified a woman he had drawn as a missing person reported in 1994. In Arkansas, his confession matched a body found behind a warehouse that had never been classified as homicide. Families began receiving phone calls from detectives asking if they recognized drawings of women who had vanished decades earlier. In some cases, relatives identified clothing, hairstyles, or scars that only family members would know. In others, DNA was exhumed and matched to evidence stored in police lockers since the 1970s. Each confirmation added another number to his count, building a list that grew month by month. By early 2019, he had confessed to more than 60 murders. By mid-year, that number passed 80. By the end of 2019, he claimed responsibility for 93 killings across 14 states between 1970 and 2005. Investigators confirmed at least 50 of those murders through physical evidence, witness statements, and crime scene matches. Dozens more were classified as highly probable, supported by consistent details that only the killer could have known. What made the confessions credible was not the number, but the accuracy. He described the layout of apartments that no longer existed. He named bars that had closed 30 years earlier. He recalled street names, weather conditions, and the positions of bodies in ways that matched archived police reports. In case after case, detectives found that his memory aligned with the record. By 2020, the FBI officially credited him with at least 60 confirmed victims, with another 33 considered credible but unverified due to missing evidence. That total made him the most prolific serial killer in American history. The man who had been convicted of only 3 murders now carried a body count that dwarfed every known predator before him. When asked why he confessed, he offered no remorse, only explanation. He said he wanted credit for what he had done, and he wanted to be known. He said the burden of memory had grown heavy, and he no longer cared about consequences. For James Holland, the confessions were not a victory, but a reckoning, revealing how many years had been lost to silence. When investigators finished compiling Samuel Little's confessions, they did not see a single failure, but a chain of failures stretching across 40 years and half the country. In Missouri, a woman had identified him in 1976 and watched him walk free by Christmas. In Mississippi, 2 survivors had pointed to him and been ignored by a grand jury. In Florida, he had been acquitted of murder while a prison officer warned the FBI about his claims. In California, dozens of deaths had been ruled accidental when they were homicides. The pattern that emerged was not incompetence, but bias, since most of his victims were poor, black, addicted, homeless, or involved in sex work. Their deaths did not trigger full investigations, and their disappearances rarely made headlines. Medical examiners accepted overdose and exposure without questioning bruises on necks. Detectives closed files when families did not push back. Courts discounted testimony from women with criminal records. Fragmented policing made the problem worse, since no agency tracked his movement across state lines. Each jurisdiction saw only 1 death, 1 assault, 1 theft, never the whole picture. Before national databases existed, his arrests in one state never reached investigators in another. Even after VICAP and CODIS were created, no one flagged him as a traveling threat. The cost of those failures appeared not only in deaths, but in wrongful convictions. In Texas, a man named Timothy Cole was wrongly convicted in 1986 for the rape and murder of a woman later confessed by Little. Cole died in prison before DNA cleared his name. In another case in California, a man named Reggie Franklin was wrongly suspected before Little's confession resolved the file. Each exoneration showed how the absence of answers had destroyed lives beyond the victims themselves. Review boards later concluded that dozens of cases could have been solved earlier if strangulation had been better understood, if toxicology had not replaced autopsy, and if investigators had shared information across borders. The technology that finally caught him in 2012 had existed in pieces for years, but nobody assembled those pieces until it was too late. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died at age 80 in a California prison hospital from complications related to diabetes and heart disease. No family claimed his body, and no funeral was held. His death ended the interviews, leaving dozens of cases still unresolved and many families without certainty. What remained after his death was not closure, but a ledger of missed chances. More than 40 years had passed between his first murder and his confession. In that time, courts had doubted victims, police had closed files, and institutions had chosen convenience over caution. His case exposed how easily predators move through systems built without coordination, and how often society decides whose lives are worth counting. The number 93 became a headline, but the real story was how long it took anyone to start counting at all. Even today, investigators continue to review unsolved strangulation deaths from the 1970s through the 2000s, comparing them to his travel routes and methods. Some families still wait for confirmation, hoping a drawing or a DNA test will finally give a name to a body found long ago. The legacy he left behind was not only the highest body count in American history, but a map of every place where the system looked away. The unfinished cases remain, not as mysteries, but as reminders of what indifference costs when it is allowed to last for decades.